The story of World War II is usually told through battles, generals, and turning points. D-Day, Stalingrad, Midway. Historians debate strategy, students memorize dates, and documentaries replay footage of tanks rolling across fields and planes dogfighting in cloudless skies. But there's another war that determined the outcome just as much, a war fought not with bullets, but with rail cars, cargo ships, and assembly lines. A war of tonnage and timelines, of supply depots and shipping manifests. This is the logistics war, and it's the war nobody talks about. When Germany invaded Poland on September 1, 1939, the Wehrmacht moved with unprecedented speed. Blitzkrieg wasn't just a tactical innovation, it was a logistical statement. Fast-moving armored columns, supplied by trucks and airdrops, overwhelmed their enemies before they could respond. Polish forces, still relying heavily on horse-drawn transport, couldn't reposition quickly enough. The German advantage wasn't just better tanks or tactics, it was better supply chains. Panzer divisions could advance 50 miles in a day because fuel trucks followed close behind, because maintenance units repaired breakdowns on the move, because the entire system was designed for rapid warfare. But this speed came with a hidden cost. The German war machine was built for short, decisive campaigns. Extended operations meant extended supply lines, and extended supply lines meant vulnerability. Every mile the Wehrmacht advanced was another mile that supplies had to travel. Every victory meant capturing and securing new territory that needed garrisons, communications, and logistics support. The German army had motorized its frontline units, but behind them, hundreds of thousands of horses still pulled supply wagons. This contradiction, modern warfare supported by 19th century logistics, would eventually strangle Germany's war effort. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the United States was still at peace. Americans watched newsreels of European battles with mixed feelings of sympathy and isolation, but American industry was already preparing for something no one had seen before, the largest logistical operation in human history. Even before Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt's Lend-Lease program had begun transforming American factories into an arsenal for embattled democracies.
The numbers are staggering. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States produced 300,000 aircraft, 88,000 tanks, 3 million machine guns, and 41 billion rounds of ammunition. Factories that had built automobiles now assembled bombers. Shipyards expanded overnight. Workers who had never held a wrench became welders, riveters, and machinists. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, building the weapons their husbands and sons would carry into combat. But producing weapons is only half the battle. The real challenge was getting them where they needed to be, across oceans, through enemy territory, to front lines that shifted every day. A tank built in Detroit had to reach a battlefield in North Africa or France or the Philippines. That meant loading it onto a train, moving it to a port, hoisting it onto a cargo ship, sailing across submarine-infested waters, unloading it on a distant shore, and finally delivering it to a unit that needed it. And all of this had to happen while the enemy was actively trying to stop it. Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany through 1940 and 1941. After the fall of France, the British Isles became Europe's last redoubt of resistance. Churchill rallied his people with stirring speeches. The Royal Air Force fought off the Luftwaffe in the skies over England, and British determination became legendary. But determination doesn't fuel aircraft or feed soldiers. The island nation had the will to fight, but not the resources. Food, fuel, ammunition, everything had to cross the Atlantic, and Germany knew it. Admiral Karl Donitz commanded Germany's U-boat fleet with brutal efficiency. His submarines prowled the shipping lanes like wolves, striking convoys in coordinated attacks and vanishing beneath the waves before escorts could respond. Merchant sailors faced a terrifying reality. Their ships were slow, unarmed, and filled with explosive cargo. When a torpedo struck, men had seconds to abandon ship before it sank or exploded. In freezing Atlantic waters, survival time was measured in minutes. U-boats sank merchant vessels faster than they could be replaced. In 1942 alone, German submarines destroyed over 1,600 Allied ships, sending millions of tons of supplies to the ocean floor.
This was the Battle of the Atlantic, a logistics war disguised as naval combat. There were no dramatic beach landings, no iconic photographs, no clear moments of victory, just an endless struggle of numbers and attrition. Whoever controlled the sea lanes controlled the war. Britain couldn't fight without supplies. The Soviet Union, bleeding against the German invasion, desperately needed equipment, and the United States had to deliver. The Liberty Ship program became America's answer. These were simple, mass-produced cargo vessels built in shipyards that sprang up almost overnight along both coasts. Liberty ships weren't elegant. They were welded together in sections, not riveted like traditional vessels, which purists considered inferior craftsmanship. But they worked, and more importantly, they could be built fast. At peak production, American workers were completing a Liberty ship every day. The record was set in November 1942 when the Robert E. Peary was launched just 4 days and 15 hours after her keel was laid. But ships alone weren't enough. Convoys had to be organized, routes calculated, losses absorbed, and replacements built. Escorts had to be trained and equipped. New technologies, sonar, radar, depth charges had to be deployed. Code breakers worked to crack German naval communications. Long-range aircraft began providing air cover over previously undefended stretches of ocean. The Atlantic became a chessboard where tonnage mattered more than territory, where victory meant delivering more supplies than the enemy could sink. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet Union faced a different logistics nightmare. When Germany invaded in June 1941, Operation Barbarossa shattered Soviet border defenses. German armies advanced hundreds of miles in weeks. Soviet forces retreated in chaos, abandoning factories, railroads, and supply depots. Hitler believed the Soviet Union would collapse within months. But Stalin ordered something unprecedented: the evacuation of entire industries. Over 1,500 factories were dismantled, loaded onto trains, and moved east of the Ural Mountains, beyond the reach of German bombers. Machinery, raw materials, entire assembly lines, even factory workers and their families, all were transported over 1,000 miles. Workers reassembled these factories in Siberia, while German bombs fell on the sites they had abandoned. They worked through winter in unheated buildings, sleeping beside their machines, living on meager rations. Within months, these relocated factories were producing tanks again. By 1943, Soviet factories were outproducing German ones, despite losing the most industrialized parts of their country. But Soviet production alone wasn't enough. Stalin needed time to rebuild, and time required supplies. American Lend-Lease aid began flowing through 3 dangerous routes. Arctic convoys sailed to Murmansk through waters patrolled by U-boats and within range of German aircraft and surface ships. The Persian corridor brought supplies through Iran's southern ports and up through the Caucasus. The Pacific route crossed from Alaska to Vladivostok, technically safe from German attack, but subject to Japanese surveillance. The Soviet Union received 400,000 trucks, more than their own factories produced during the entire war. They received 12,000 armored vehicles, 11,000 aircraft, and millions of tons of food and raw materials. American trucks carried Soviet soldiers into battle. American aviation fuel powered Soviet fighters. American Spam fed Red Army soldiers. Soviet Marshal Zhukov later admitted that without American trucks, locomotives, and supplies, the Red Army couldn't have continued fighting. Soviet tanks were built in Soviet factories, but they rolled on American wheels, fueled by American gasoline, supported by American logistics. This was the fundamental equation of World War II. Battles determined where lines appeared on maps, but logistics determined whether armies could reach those battles and fight when they arrived. Generals planned operations based on what supplies they had or expected to receive. Offensives stalled when fuel ran out, not when enemy resistance proved too strong. Defenders held positions because they had ammunition or surrendered when their supplies were exhausted. Logistics determined where battles could be fought and who would win them. The invisible backbone of supply chains and shipping routes and railway schedules would prove just as decisive as any clash of armies. And as the war progressed, the nations that mastered logistics would find themselves with an advantage no amount of tactical brilliance could overcome. Part 2. The Breaking Point. By 1943, the war had reached a critical phase. The initial shocks had passed, the lightning victories, the desperate retreats, the moments when everything seemed lost. Now the conflict had settled into something grimmer, a test of endurance, production, and logistics. Germany was overstretched, fighting on multiple fronts, with supply lines that stretched from North Africa to the gates of Moscow. Japan controlled a vast Pacific empire, but lacked the shipping to supply it. The Allies, meanwhile, were turning logistics into a science. Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa in November 1942, was a logistics proof of concept. American forces landed in Morocco and Algeria with everything they needed: fuel, ammunition, food, even portable hospitals. Ships unloaded directly onto beaches. Engineers established supply depots within hours of landing. This wasn't improvisation, it was the result of months of planning, rehearsals, and coordination between the U.S. Army, Navy, and newly formed logistics commands. American forces landed with confidence born from superior supply. Each soldier carried more equipment than his Axis counterpart. Each unit had more vehicles, more spare parts, more of everything. But as they pushed east toward Tunisia, they discovered what the Germans already knew. North African terrain devoured supplies. Trucks broke down in the sand, their engines clogged with fine desert dust. Water became more valuable than ammunition in the scorching heat. Fuel consumption exceeded all estimates as vehicles struggled across soft ground. The green American forces learned hard lessons about the gap between planning and reality. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Africa Corps had been facing these problems for years. Rommel was perhaps Germany's most celebrated commander, a tactical genius who won battles against superior numbers through speed, deception, and aggressive maneuver. But his brilliance couldn't overcome the fact that his supplies had to cross the Mediterranean under constant Allied air attack, then traverse hundreds of miles of desert on inadequate roads with insufficient trucks. British code breakers read his supply schedules. British submarines and aircraft attacked his convoys. Only a fraction of what Rommel needed ever reached him. Rommel wrote in his diary that he was fighting two enemies, the British Eighth Army and his own supply situation. He could win battles, but not campaigns. Every victory pushed him further from his supply bases. Every advance stretched his logistics thinner. When the Allies finally cornered Axis forces in Tunisia in May 1943, it wasn't just superior numbers that won, it was superior logistics. Allied forces had secure supply lines across the Atlantic and through Gibraltar. They had air superiority, which meant their trucks could move in daylight without fear of attack. They had fuel, ammunition, and replacements. The surrounded Axis forces had none of these things. Nearly 250,000 German and Italian soldiers surrendered, not because they lacked courage, but because they lacked everything else. The Pacific War was even more demanding. Europe had roads, railroads, and infrastructure that armies could use or capture. The Pacific had thousands of miles of empty ocean dotted with islands that had nothing, no ports, no airfields, no supply depots. Everything had to be brought by ship and created from scratch. Island-hopping campaigns meant establishing entirely new supply bases on captured territory, often while under attack. Each island needed airstrips, fuel depots, ammunition dumps, hospitals, and maintenance facilities. Seabees, construction battalions, became as important as combat troops. They landed behind the first wave of Marines and immediately began building. Under fire, working around the clock, they transformed coral atolls into functioning military bases. On Guadalcanal, Seabees finished an airfield that Japanese forces had started, completing it even as Japanese ships shelled them at night. But Japan faced an impossible equation. The empire had expanded to secure resources, oil from the East Indies, rubber from Malaya, rice from across Asia. But empires need shipping to function. Raw materials had to reach factories in Japan. Finished weapons had to reach troops scattered across the Pacific. Fuel had to reach the combined fleet. Food had to reach garrisons on distant islands. American submarines began sinking Japanese merchant ships faster than they could be replaced. Unlike Germany's U-boat campaign, which ultimately failed, the American submarine war succeeded beyond all expectations. Japanese merchant marine losses mounted steadily, 10% in 1942, 20% in 1943, 40% in 1944. By 1945, Japan had lost over 60% of its merchant fleet. Raw materials couldn't reach factories. Finished goods couldn't reach troops. The Japanese war economy was suffocating. Japanese soldiers on bypassed islands received no supplies. Garrisons were left to grow their own food or starve. The great fortress of Rabaul, which once threatened Allied operations, was isolated and ignored. Its 100,000 troops effectively removed from the war without a major battle. Japanese commanders watched helplessly as the logistics network that sustained their empire disintegrated. Meanwhile, the United States was solving problems Japan couldn't even address. After D-Day in June 1944, Allied armies broke out of Normandy and raced across France. General George Patton's Third Army advanced so quickly that logistics struggled to keep up. The problem wasn't production. American factories were operating at full capacity. The problem was delivery.
Normandy's artificial harbors could only handle so much cargo. French railroads and bridges had been destroyed by Allied bombing. The solution was improvisation on a massive scale.
The Red Ball Express became legendary, a truck convoy system that kept Allied armies supplied. More than 6,000 trucks operated on designated one-way routes, a circular highway system dedicated entirely to military supplies. Trucks rolled 24 hours a day. When Patton's Third Army consumed 400,000 gallons of fuel per day, the Red Ball Express delivered it. Drivers, many of them African-American soldiers serving in segregated units, drove without sleep, navigating bombed roads and hostile territory. They kept the advance moving when nothing else could. But even the Red Ball Express had limits. By September 1944, Allied forces had outrun their supplies. Eisenhower faced a choice: concentrate resources for a single thrust into Germany or spread them across a broad front. Montgomery wanted priority for a northern drive through Holland. Patton demanded fuel for a drive through the Siegfried Line. Both couldn't be fully supplied. Eisenhower chose a compromise, and Operation Market Garden, Montgomery's ambitious airborne assault, failed partly because logistics couldn't support it adequately. The greatest logistics challenge had been Operation Overlord itself. D-Day required landing 156,000 troops on French beaches, along with their weapons, vehicles, and supplies. Then those forces had to be sustained and reinforced while fighting inland. The planning took years. The Allies built artificial harbors, the Mulberry Harbors, from thousands of tons of concrete and steel, towed them across the English Channel, and anchored them off Normandy beaches. They laid underwater fuel pipelines called Pluto, pipeline under the ocean, to pump fuel directly from England to France. In the first month after D-Day, Allied forces unloaded 850,000 tons of supplies on Normandy beaches. Specialized units organized this chaos. Beachmasters directed traffic. Quartermasters tracked supplies. Engineers repaired equipment. When a storm destroyed one of the Mulberry Harbors, logistics officers adapted, increasing unloading directly onto beaches despite the inefficiency. Germany couldn't respond. Allied air superiority meant German reinforcements crawled toward Normandy, constantly bombed and strafed. Rail lines were destroyed, bridges collapsed, fuel was scarce. Panzer divisions arrived at the front with half their tanks left behind due to mechanical breakdowns and lack of fuel. German commanders fought brilliantly with inadequate resources, while Allied commanders sometimes stumbled with overwhelming supply advantages. The contrast was clearest during the Battle of the Bulge. Germany's last major offensive in December 1944 was a desperate gamble. Hitler committed his final reserves to a thrust through the Ardennes, hoping to split Allied armies and capture the vital port of Antwerp. But German planners knew they didn't have enough fuel for the entire operation. Their plan depended on capturing Allied fuel supplies in the opening days. When American defenders held key fuel depots and crossroads, the offensive began to starve. Meanwhile, the Allies redirected their entire logistics network to stop the German breakthrough. Within days, Patton's Third Army pivoted 90 degrees north and marched to relieve surrounded American forces at Bastogne with full supplies. Trucks rerouted. Supply priorities shifted. Airdrops delivered ammunition to encircled troops. The same logistics system that had struggled to supply the broad advance across France proved flexible enough to concentrate resources where needed most.
The German offensive collapsed not just from Allied firepower, but from logistical starvation. German tanks ran out of fuel and were abandoned. German soldiers were found with empty rifles, having exhausted their ammunition.
In the Pacific, the Philippines campaign demonstrated American logistics dominance on an even larger scale. The invasion fleet for Leyte in October 1944 included 700 ships carrying 200,000 troops and all their equipment. Behind them came more ships with replacements, fuel, ammunition, medical supplies, and even luxuries. Yes, ice cream. American logistics was so robust that frontline troops received ice cream makers and Coca-Cola bottling plants. This wasn't frivolity, it was a demonstration of overwhelming capacity. Japan, by contrast, couldn't even supply its defenders adequately. Troops on Leyte fought without resupply as American submarines sank reinforcement convoys. Garrison forces throughout the Philippines were isolated and overwhelmed. The Japanese Navy launched its last major operation, the Battle of Leyte Gulf, knowing that many ships barely had enough fuel for a one-way trip. Some commanders planned to beach their ships and fight as infantry if they survived the battle. They had no fuel to return to base. By early 1945, the logistics war was over. The shooting would continue for months, with terrible casualties on both sides, but the outcome was inevitable. The Allies could replace every loss, sustain every advance, and supply every operation. The Axis couldn't. The mathematics of logistics had determined the war's conclusion. Part 3. The mathematics of victory. Wars are decided by many factors: strategy, tactics, morale, technology, leadership. But World War II proved that logistics could trump them all. The final year of the war showed this repeatedly in every theater, on every front. By 1945, the conflict had become a mathematical equation, and the numbers favored only one outcome. The Allied strategic bombing campaign against Germany depended entirely on logistics. Every bombing raid over Germany required fuel, bombs, spare parts, and replacement aircraft. The scale was unprecedented. A single mission by the 8th Air Force might involve 1,000 bombers and 500 escort fighters. Each B-17 Flying Fortress carried up to 8,000 pounds of bombs and consumed thousands of gallons of fuel. Each mission meant potential losses: aircraft shot down, damaged planes requiring repair, engines needing replacement. The 8th Air Force in England consumed more supplies than the entire U.S. Army had used in World War I. Bomb tonnage dropped on Germany increased every month, not because of tactical breakthroughs, but because the logistics pipeline grew more efficient. Air bases in England became small cities with repair depots, fuel farms, ammunition dumps, and thousands of support personnel. For every pilot who flew combat missions, 20 men worked on the ground keeping aircraft operational. Germany tried to respond with wonder weapons. V-1 flying bombs and V-2 rockets terrorized London. The Me-262 jet fighter flew faster than anything the Allies had. New U-boat designs promised to turn the Battle of the Atlantic. German engineers designed weapons that were genuinely revolutionary. Some worked brilliantly in testing, but they couldn't be produced in sufficient numbers or supplied adequately to change the war's outcome. The Me-262 was perhaps the most striking example. This jet fighter could outfly any Allied aircraft. In the hands of experienced pilots, it was devastating.
But Germany lacked the fuel to train pilots properly or fly combat missions consistently. Jet engines consumed enormous quantities of fuel and had short operational lives. Replacement engines were scarce. Allied bombing had disrupted production. By the time Me-262s entered service in meaningful numbers, Germany couldn't supply them. Advanced weapons without logistics support became expensive showpieces, impressive in museums, irrelevant on battlefields. The Soviet advance into Eastern Europe demonstrated logistics on a continental scale. The Red Army's offensives in 1944 and 1945 moved millions of troops and thousands of tanks across devastated terrain. Cities had been destroyed, bridges were rubble, railroads needed complete reconstruction. Yet Soviet armies kept advancing, supplied by a system that was brutal and effective in equal measure. Soviet logistics wasn't elegant, it was pragmatic to the point of ruthlessness. Armies lived off the land when possible, requisitioning food and supplies from occupied territories, friendly or otherwise. When local resources weren't enough, massive supply shipments arrived via reconstructed railways. Soviet engineers rebuilt rail lines as armies advanced, sometimes completing dozens of miles per day. American trucks provided mobility. Studebaker trucks became synonymous with Soviet logistics. American aviation fuel powered Soviet aircraft, but the organizational ruthlessness was purely Soviet. General Zhukov's offensives operated on a scale that dwarfed Western operations. Operation Bagration in summer 1944 committed 2.3 million troops, 4,000 tanks, and 5,000 aircraft to the destruction of German Army Group Center. The logistics preparation took months. Ammunition was stockpiled. Soviet artillery consumed shells at rates that shocked German defenders. Fuel was positioned forward. Replacement equipment was ready. When the offensive began, German forces faced not just superior numbers, but unlimited supplies. Soviet attacks didn't pause when ammunition ran low. There was always more.
The final assault on Germany came from east and west simultaneously. Millions of Allied troops converged on a shrinking German state. Eisenhower's forces crossed the Rhine in March 1945 with overwhelming logistics support. Bailey bridges spanned the river within hours of capture. Pontoon bridges carried endless streams of vehicles. Supplies flowed forward without interruption. German defenders fought hard, but they fought without fuel, without ammunition, without food, without hope. Logistics collapse preceded military collapse. German units received orders to counterattack, but had no fuel to move. Artillery batteries had shells for one engagement, then fell silent. Supply depots were empty. Even when German soldiers wanted to fight, they often lacked the means. Hitler issued increasingly fantastical orders from his Berlin bunker, moving divisions that existed only on paper, expecting supplies that would never arrive. The contrast between Allied and German logistics in the war's final months was absolute. American soldiers advanced with chocolate bars and cigarettes. German soldiers scrounged for bread. Allied tanks refueled from following trucks. German tanks sat abandoned along roadsides, empty of fuel, sometimes blown up by their own crews to prevent capture. The Wehrmacht, which had begun the war as the most modern army in the world, ended it relying on horses and bicycles. In the Pacific, the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were the ultimate logistics weapon. Not because of their destructive power alone, but because they represented the culmination of American industrial and logistical supremacy.
The B-29 Super Fortress bombers that delivered them were the most advanced aircraft of the war, pressurized, long-range, capable of flying at altitudes that put them beyond most Japanese defenses.
These bombers flew from Tinian Island in the Marianas. 2 years earlier, Tinian had been in Japanese hands. The Americans invaded, captured it, and transformed it into the busiest airfield in the world, all in less than a year. Seabees bulldozed the island flat and paved it with concrete. They built runways long enough for fully loaded B-29s. They constructed fuel storage for thousands of gallons of aviation gas. They established maintenance facilities, living quarters, and command centers. At its peak, Tinian's North Field had 4 parallel runways and housed hundreds of B-29s. Aircraft took off and landed every few minutes around the clock. The atomic attacks were possible because American logistics made them possible. The bombs themselves resulted from the Manhattan Project, which consumed billions of dollars and employed 130,000 people. But delivering them required the entire logistics system: shipping the bombs across the Pacific, maintaining the aircraft, training the crews, establishing the bases. Every element depended on supply chains that stretched back to the American mainland. Japan surrendered not just because of atomic bombs, but because the entire logistics foundation of the empire had crumbled. The home islands were under blockade. American submarines and mines had made shipping suicidal. Cities were being firebombed with incendiary attacks that killed more people than the atomic bombs. Food was scarce. The average Japanese civilian was surviving on a starvation diet. Industry had stopped. Factories lacked raw materials, workers lacked food, and Allied bombing had destroyed critical infrastructure. Even if Japan wanted to continue fighting, there was nothing left to fight with.
Japanese military forces outside the home islands were equally helpless. Hundreds of thousands of troops remained scattered across China, Southeast Asia, and Pacific Islands. They were undefeated in the field, but completely isolated. No supplies reached them, no reinforcements arrived, no orders came except to continue resisting. When Japan surrendered, these forces laid down their arms not because they had been conquered, but because the logistics network that connected them to their homeland no longer existed.
The final accounting tells the story with brutal clarity. The United States produced 2/3 of all Allied military equipment during the war. American factories outproduced Germany and Japan combined. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States built 300,000 aircraft, 88,000 tanks, 2.4 million trucks, 6,500 naval vessels, and 41 billion rounds of ammunition. But production meant nothing without delivery. The U.S. military moved 7 million troops overseas and kept them supplied across 2 oceans. American logistics delivered 450,000 tons of supplies every single day by war's end. This included everything from bullets to bandages, from tanks to toothpaste, from ammunition to aspirin. The system tracked individual items through a distribution network that spanned the globe. Quartermasters knew what every unit needed and when they needed it. Supply officers calculated requirements months in advance. Transportation specialists routed cargo through the most efficient channels. This wasn't just industrial capacity, it was organizational genius. Logistics networks coordinated millions of moving parts, production schedules, shipping routes, port operations, transportation networks, supply distribution, and frontline delivery. The entire system worked because thousands of nameless planners, engineers, and workers made it work. They developed new methods, solved unprecedented problems, and created systems that became templates for everything that followed. The logistics lessons of World War II shaped everything that came after. The Cold War was partly a logistics competition. Who could supply allies better, project power further, sustain forces in distant theaters? The Berlin airlift demonstrated that logistics could be a strategic weapon in peacetime. American military doctrine put logistics first because commanders learned that tactical brilliance without supplies is just expensive failure. Every military operation since 1945 has been planned logistics first, ensuring supply lines before committing forces. Global supply chains today reflect lessons learned moving armies across continents. Container shipping, just-in-time delivery, distributed networks, integrated systems all have roots in World War II logistics. The miracle of modern commerce, where goods travel effortlessly across the world, emerged from the necessity of moving military supplies efficiently during the war. The battles are remembered: Normandy, Stalingrad, Midway. The generals are celebrated: Eisenhower, Zhukov, MacArthur. But World War II was won in shipyards, on convoy routes, in truck convoys, and on railway networks. It was won by the people who ensured soldiers had bullets when they needed them, fuel when they advanced, and food when they rested. The logistics war was fought by quartermasters, not commanders, by merchant sailors, not admirals, by truck drivers, not tank crews, by factory workers, not fighter pilots. Their war had no dramatic turning points, no heroic last stands, no moments captured in famous photographs, just the grinding, essential work of moving supplies from factories to front lines every single day for years until the war was won. That's the war nobody talks about, but it's the war that decided everything. When historians analyze World War II, they focus on strategy and battles, but the real story is simpler and more profound. The side that could supply its forces won. The side that mastered logistics won. The side that turned supply chains into weapons won. Everything else was just details.